Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it. Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about this. This is the Brawler 64. Before we go into this, though, I do want to say thank you to Castlemania Games. They provided this to me for free for the purposes of review. If you're interested in it or any of the other stuff that Castlemania Games has, I put a link in the description. Feel free to click there and go check them out. So, what is it? What are we doing here? What are we talking about? Well, this is a brand new Nintendo 64 controller. Not just in the sense that it's obviously brand new in a box, but also brand new in that it was designed only a couple of years ago. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the history of this thing, and then I'm going to, basically review it, check it out, and tell you what I think of it. So, so this thing was made by a company called Retro Fighters, and I believe they originally went to either it was Indiegogo or Kickstarter a couple of years ago and said, hey, we want to make this like new Nintendo 64 controller, and they eventually got their funding and they produced the controller. It actually came out last year, so sorry I'm a little late to the party on that, but there is a reason for this. Now last year the initial version of this came out, and people discovered there was actually a design flaw in the controller. The design flaw was if you pressed a certain combination of buttons in a certain sequence, you could, I believe, take the left thumbstick and actually cause it to kind of scrape against some of the other buttons. Now, people pointed out in the controller's defense that there was no game on the Nintendo 64 that would ever require you to hit that combination of buttons, which means the only time you would ever run into the problem was either A, if you just completely did it by accident, or B, you were intentionally trying to replicate a known problem. That said, Retro Fighters did not ignore the problem. They said, okay, we're going to go back, and they fixed it. So it took about an extra year, but they did redesign it a little bit. They did get the new versions out, and this is the revised version that does not have said issue. So talking about it from that standpoint, what I think the original intention was, is you look at it and you go, okay, I think there's two reasons that this controller came into existence. One, the company's name is Retro Fighters, so it was very likely designed for a fighting game. Now, one must wonder what that fighting game might have been. Was the name Brawler 64? I don't know. Yeah, we're talking about Super Smash Brothers. Now, obviously, Smash Brothers Brawl is a GameCube game, not actually the original one, but I can't help but assume that that's like really the reason this thing exists, is that so people who want to play with a Nintendo 64 controller and play Smash Brothers but want to be more competitive or just want a different experience, I guess, to an extent, a more comfortable gaming experience, they have that option now. And the other aspect to it is, this is more my opinion, I also think that the Nintendo 64 controller seen here, the traditional three-prong controller, while I grew up with this and I have no problem playing a game with it, I'm completely used to it, whatever, you have to understand that there's been a couple generations of gamers since then. And a lot of them have become very used to wider berth controllers that have two handles, namely things like PS3, PS4, Xbox 360, Xbox One. That has become the controller. So a lot of stuff before that has become just kind of like, what the hell is that, to a whole generation. So I kind of think it was a combination of those two things, was that they wanted to do something very specifically for Smash Bros., but also they wanted to make a controller that was much more modern feeling for a retro console, which is kind of an interesting approach to take. And I know that that's not the first time they've done it, and nor is it the last. They are working on a Dreamcast version of this exact same concept, and I'm excited to check that one out when it happens. But before that, they made this. This is an NES version. Now, when I first saw this, I thought, wow, that's overkill, because the NES consists of a D-pad, a start, select, B, and A. And this has, trigger, it has bumpers, it's got A and B, it's got clear, turbo, start, select, two thumbsticks, as well as a D-pad. Now you go like, how? But really what it is that most of these functions are cloned. So depending on what type of game you're playing, you have the exact same A or B function, but in a different location. And then you have the D-pad functionality down here, etc. So you have got a bunch of options when you decide to play with this controller. Like I said, when I first saw this, I thought, yeah, I don't think I need to play the NES that way. But it grew on me. As the more I played the NES with this thing, I realized I didn't really want to go back to the traditional rectangular controller. I actually liked this a lot more. Maybe it's because that's true, that our hands have just kind of evolved into saying, hey, a controller is two prongs and slightly wide. I don't know. I am going to check out the Retro Fighters Brawler, obviously, here and see what I think of it, but I kind of think there's something to that argument. So that said, let's go ahead and open it up and take a look at it. And inside we have, there's multiple colors of this thing, by the way. This is the traditional gray one that's meant to look like, basically the color scheme of an original Nintendo 64 controller. So here it is. Now it has in the back the expansion port, presumably not only for the memory card, but it seems the rumble feature. It would have been nice if the rumble feature was built into the controller. I don't think that it is. I will double check on that, but I'm pretty sure it's not. But we'll get back to that. The cable here, let's see what the cable length of this thing is, because maybe that's, ooh, yeah, see, check that out. I can't even do the full thing. Whereas if we take the original Nintendo 64 controller, this is basically a meter. It's a little over 3 feet long, and the newer one is much longer than that. It's probably like 4 or 5 feet. So I would have told him, maybe in hindsight, not that that's a bad length, but you probably could have gone longer with it. Like the Retrobit, Sega Genesis, and Sega Saturn controllers were actually 10 feet long. Obviously, I haven't measured this yet, but yeah, if it's actually, you know what, this might be. This is probably about 6 feet, if I had to guess. And 6 feet is certainly not bad. I think they probably should have aimed for 10. Now, holding it, it feels fine. You know, I think that just my first impressions, because I had never held this controller before. The back part here where you have to put the rumble pack or memory card in, I feel like kind of my middle fingers are kind of being pressed against it uncomfortably. Not a huge fan of that. And the D-pad feels a little, or sorry, not the D-pad, the left thumbstick feels a little different. Now, I was at a convention at AVGC in New Jersey, and I was talking to Gilly the Kid, another YouTuber I'm sure a lot of you guys know. He actually literally bought one of these at the convention, and he was just talking about it, and he basically said, like, one of the things that's odd about this controller, and I have to confirm this myself, he said that the original Nintendo 64 controller, the thumbstick was an octagon, like an octagon as far as the number of sensor points. But it was a slightly malformed octagon intentionally, and this one is more of a perfect octagon. Now, what does that mean? It means, in theory, in some games where you could be used to a character moving a certain amount based on this controller, or the game could have been designed around that, it will now be slightly different. Again, I haven't tried it. I'm curious to see if that's actually the case. But I can tell you that it does feel different. Not necessarily bad, but different. I'm very curious to see how it will play. I have to admit, that's actually really bothering me the more I hold this, is how my middle fingers kind of keep bumping into the back of this thing. We'll see. Maybe I'll end up liking it as I play it more, but that's kind of my first impressions on it. Aside from that, seems good. It's got turbo and clear functions. Not sure what clear does. You have 2 Z buttons, by the way. Obviously, the original only had 1, but you have 2, probably just based on like what game you're playing or which, you know, what you prefer to kind of, you know, whichever finger you prefer to use for shooters or anything like that, maybe GoldenEye, whatever. I'm sure people will be like, well, why isn't there a second thumbstick? You know, I gotta say, my initial reaction to that question would have been, there's no reason to have one. You know, it would have been something like, well, you know, there's this common misconception I've noticed, particularly with people who request a new Dreamcast controller, is that if you added a second thumbstick, that somehow would create support for new camera angles in games, which is ridiculous. But people seem to think that. However, in the case of this, I do know there were games where the C buttons did act as that, and I can't even say that they couldn't have done it because the NES version had it. So I'm kind of with you if you were probably thinking it would have been cool to have a second D-pad or a second joystick on this thing. That might have been useful and just replicated the C buttons. And in some games that would have been useful, in others, a lot of them, it wouldn't have been. But yeah, maybe there's a reason they didn't do that. All right, guys, so I've been using it for a while, and it's time for final thoughts. Not a whole lot to add, to be honest, to what I said before. There are some changes, though. Initially, I said that the back part kind of bothered me, but as I was sitting there playing it, I realized, you know, that was just initial impression. You know, really playing it, it really never came up, and I don't think I ever really even noticed it. So I withdraw that criticism. I did find at times the aiming system on the thumbstick to not be quite as precise as the original. Now, I don't know if that could be one of two things. That could actually be a problem with the controller, kind of like what Gilly was describing, although I don't remember it being bad, just kind of awkward. The other thing it could be is, to be honest with you, the evolution of our hands. Like I said, when GoldenEye came out, this was how you played a first-person shooter on a console. Whereas now, going back to that system is weird. I do really seriously feel that a second thumbstick that mapped out the C buttons would have been helpful in a lot of situations. It is surprising to me that they didn't do it, considering they did do it on the NES controller. There must be some reason for that. I did check it with the Rumble Pack, and I played Star Fox for quite some time. It didn't seem to impede anything. It seemed to work just fine. Obviously, weight changes when you do that. And there must be some reason that wasn't put in there. It could just be budgetary. I mean, developing Rumble technology to put inside the controller could be cost prohibitive. I completely understand that, especially when a pre-existing device does exist. But imagine how much nicer it would be if that was built in. Although that might have caused conflicts in games, possibly, because if you put a memory card in there and it thinks there's a Rumble Pack, I don't know what it would do. So maybe there is a logistical reason why they didn't do that. To be honest with you, I really didn't use the turbo functions. According to the guide, all you really have to do is hold the turbo button down and it'll activate, and to turn it off, you hold down the clear button. But I really saw no situation where I personally felt that needed to use that. Switching between the two triggers, like I said, they have Z on here twice. This was actually quite nice, because if your finger started to hurt doing it one way, all you do is switch to the other finger and you're good to go. Yeah, so the other thing is, according to the guide, I don't have one of these, but according to the guide, the transfer pack does not work with this thing. So the memory card works, Rumble Pack works, and transfer pack doesn't work. But outside of that, yeah, it was a perfectly good experience. I think this, to be honest with you, is the way I'm going to be playing the N64 from now on. I think I am going to retire the original controller, because I did find this to ultimately be better. I will say, initially, as I was playing, it was kind of awkward to kind of get used to, because I was so used to this controller. But once I got past that hurdle, which you might have to do, everyone has to play it and find that out for themselves. Initially, I was kind of like, I don't know, this isn't, I'm not really enjoying this. But as I kept playing with it, that all kind of melted away, and I just ended up enjoying it and just enjoying the games, and then I had a good time with it. So I think, yeah, I'm probably going to stick with the Retro Fighters. If they do another iteration of this, I don't expect the Rumble thing to ever be incorporated for reasons I already discussed, but it would be nice to see that second thumbstick that maps out the C buttons. Not necessarily replace the C buttons, but just, I realize there's not a ton of space on there, but maybe like down here somewhere, almost mimicking where the original was, although maybe that would cause confusion for people, I don't know. But that would have been kind of an interesting idea, I think. I guess I'm not a huge fan of the thumbstick that they have. I do think that the original thumbstick was better. If that could somehow, appear on here but be more reliable, I think I would enjoy that more. The original is plastic with little textures on it, on the plastic, to kind of keep your hand in place or your finger in place. This one has more of a rubber grip, and it doesn't. I don't know. I'm not. Maybe it's just nostalgia speaking, but I'm not quite as on board there. And the placement of the buttons, this is just minor stuff. I'm just giving you my impressions as I was playing it. I kept wanting to push the C buttons as if they were the main face buttons, just because of where they're positioned. But to be fair, that is kind of a problem with the original controller as well. So they had an interesting thing they had to juggle, which was how people actually play the N64 versus trying to update the controller for a more modern thing. So when those two concepts collide, you kind of run into some just awkwardness. But while the controller is not perfect, I'm not sure how much more they really could have done to get all of us over that hurdle. I do think the one thing they could probably do, maybe make the C buttons a little smaller like they are in the original, maybe put the A and B buttons up just slightly higher, and then possibly put a second thumbstick in there that maps the C buttons. But again, I say this without being an engineer or understanding the logistics of how you would actually do that. I say that from the perspective of a customer, someone who would want to see something without really understanding necessarily how much work goes into that. So I openly admit that. But yeah, I guess that's my final thoughts is I do think this is a worthwhile product. Not perfect, but pretty good. So thank you again to Castlemania Games for hooking me up with this. Thank you guys very much for watching. If you could, please like, comment, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all later.